In the summer of 1973, a chair sat empty in a New York courtroom. The judge waited, the lawyers waited, and reporters stared at the door. It stayed closed. Somewhere between the airport, the money, and the promise to appear, a man simply stepped out of the frame and never returned. His name was Frank Larry Matthews. To some, he was a myth in motion, a kid from Durham who came north with a barber's kit and a gambler's eye, then built a narcotics network that supplied the eastern United States. Heroin and cocaine moved like weather systems across highways and city blocks, and cash appeared in stacks large enough to break the springs on a car. By his mid-20s, he was reportedly earning more in a day than most neighborhoods saw in a year. You see, New York already had its legends, the likes of Frank Lucas, Nicky Barnes, and the Five Families. They got the headlines, the movies, and the cautionary endings. Matthews did something different. He refused the leash. He found suppliers outside the Italian syndicates, dealt with Cubans and Corsicans, and turned his organization into a machine that did not ask permission. The old rules no longer applied, and that alone made him dangerous. He held meetings like a CEO. He bought a mansion on Staten Island in a neighborhood owned by the mob and parked his car across the street from power. He could be polite, even gracious, then ice cold a minute later. Some people called him strong, others called him charismatic, but everyone agreed he was ambitious. Then the circle began to close. Wiretaps clicked alive, surveillance teams shadowed his cars, and investigators mapped his routes through casinos, where cash disappeared into quiet rooms and reappeared clean. In January 1973, federal agents took him in at a gate in Las Vegas. He was charged and faced a life measured not in money, but in years. Bail fell from impossible to insulting, from $5 million to $375,000. He walked out of custody and walked straight into legend. On July 2, 1973, the government expected a defendant, but got a question that has not been answered in 50 years. Matthews did not appear. His girlfriend, Cheryl Denise Brown, was also gone. Just rumors of barrels of cash, planes in the night, islands with no extradition, and a man who understood that the only perfect plan is the one that leaves no edges to grab. What follows is not a tale of a folk hero, but the anatomy of an empire and the shape of a vanishing. We will go back to Durham, to the barbershop, to the first kilogram, to the meetings in hotel rooms, and to the moment a courtroom chair became a monument to absence. This is the story of Frank Matthews, the kingpin who built a fortune, stared down the mob, and then stepped off the map. If there is an answer, it is buried under time and concrete. If there is a lesson, it begins here, in an empty chair, and in a city that never saw him leave. Frank Larry Matthews was born on February 13, 1944, in Durham, North Carolina. The city was a patchwork of tobacco fields, red clay roads, and the sounds of factory whistles. It was also a place where a young black boy learned early that the odds were never in his favor. His mother died when he was just 4 years old, leaving him to be raised by his aunt, Marcella Steele, the wife of a police lieutenant. In a small house on the east side of town, she tried to raise him with order and discipline. But even as a child, Frank had his own sense of authority. At school, they said he was sharp with numbers and quicker with words, but too easily bored. He dropped out in the 7th grade, unwilling to follow rules that made little sense to him. The streets taught faster lessons: how to read people, how to keep quiet, and how to move when no one was looking. By 14, he was already leading a small gang of boys who stole chickens from farms at night. One evening, a farmer caught them in the act. Matthews didn't run. He picked up a brick and swung. The assault landed him in reform school in Raleigh, a state reformatory for boys. For most kids, it was punishment. For Frank, it was a classroom of another kind, where he served a year, watching older boys who knew how to survive. When he walked out, he was harder, quieter, and determined never to be poor again. He left North Carolina behind and boarded a bus, heading north to Philadelphia. The city had a rhythm that suited him. It was faster, louder, more forgiving of ambition. He started small, working as a barber and writing numbers for the neighborhood gamblers. People called him Pee-wee, but there was nothing small about his ambitions. The money in the numbers racket was fast, and he learned how to keep accounts cleaner than most of the men twice his age. It was in Philadelphia that he made his first real connections, men who crept in the background of the city's underground economy. Among them was Major Coxon, a flashy numbers boss with links to the Black Mafia. Matthews watched, listened, and learned. He picked up the art of making money multiply, the discipline of staying invisible, and the importance of knowing who to trust. By 19, he was already known to the police. A 1963 arrest nearly derailed him, but he managed to slip free by agreeing to leave the city. Instead of lying low, he went to New York, the place where numbers, power, and opportunity collided. He settled in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, a neighborhood alive with hustlers, barbers, dreamers, and dealers. There, Matthews sharpened his instincts and began building the foundation of something far larger than anyone could see. In the dim light of a barbershop mirror, Frank Matthews was no longer the boy from Durham. He was a man learning how to make money out of air. A man whose next move would turn him from a small-time collector into one of the most ambitious operators in American crime. Brooklyn in the mid-1960s was a city within a city. The brownstones of Bedford-Stuyvesant stood shoulder to shoulder, filled with working families, hustlers, and dreamers trying to make rent. Frank Matthews arrived with a barber's license, a sharp eye, and an instinct for risk. By day, he trimmed hair in a small shop on Fulton Street. By night, he collected numbers for local gamblers, moving cash through the same chairs where customers had just sat for a haircut. Every dollar that passed through his hands taught him something about power, who had it, who wanted it, and how to take it. The numbers game had rules, but Matthews never liked rules. The payouts were small, the profits slower than he wanted. Around him, another business was rising, one that promised more money and less patience: heroin. At first, he watched from a distance as the Italian families handled imports through the French connection, moving powder from Marseilles to New York. The Gambino and Bonanno families controlled most of it, and they guarded their empire with great care. Matthews tried to make contact, offering to distribute on their behalf. They refused. To them, he was an outsider, a black man with no standing in their world. Rejection didn't stop him. It clarified his purpose. If the Mafia would not let him in, he would build his own gate. Through a Harlem numbers man named Spanish Raymond Merques, Matthews met a Cuban supplier, Rolando Lucas Gonzalez Nunes. Gonzalez was tied to the underground casino circuit in the Caribbean and had access to cocaine of a purity New York had rarely seen. The first kilogram cost Matthews $20,000, a risk he took without hesitation. He sold it quickly, paid his debts, and asked for more. The relationship grew, and soon Gonzalez's shipments came regularly, moving north through channels that avoided Mafia control entirely. By 1968, Frank Matthews was no longer a small-time hustler. He was a wholesaler with connections stretching from Brooklyn to the Caribbean. His operation handled heroin and cocaine, feeding dealers in New York, Philadelphia, and beyond. He paid well, delivered on time, and demanded loyalty. His strength was simplicity: cash in, product out, no middleman. Matthews lived the way he worked, fast but measured. He bought new suits, kept his cars spotless, and moved with quiet authority. People said he spoke softly but looked straight through you. To the police, he was still a barber with a side hustle. To the streets, he was becoming something else entirely. The drug mills he built were hidden in plain sight. One on Prospect Place was known as the Ponderosa. Another on East 56th Street was called the Oak Coral. Both were fortified like bunkers, guarded by men with automatic weapons, their walls lined with steel and concrete. Inside, heroin was cut, weighed, and sealed into glass in envelopes that moved through the city like currency. Matthews didn't just control distribution, he controlled quality, setting a standard that forced other suppliers to follow. By 1971, he had become one of the most powerful figures in the East Coast narcotics trade. The DEA would later estimate that he was moving millions of dollars in drugs each month and personally earning close to $10 million a year. The Italians noticed. So did law enforcement. But Matthews had no interest in being anyone's underboss. He sought independence and recognition. That same year, he called a meeting in Atlanta. The invitation went out quietly to Black and Latino dealers across the country. Men tired of buying from the Mafia, men ready to build something of their own. The meeting drew attention from more than its guests. The DEA learned of it, watching from a distance as the nation's underground elite gathered to talk about business, freedom, and survival. Out of that meeting came a plan that would shake the foundation of organized crime. Matthews and his peers agreed to find new import routes through the Corsican and Cuban networks, cutting out La Cosa Nostra entirely. For the first time, Black and Hispanic dealers were no longer middlemen. They were suppliers, investors, and power brokers. Frank Matthews had done the unthinkable. He had built a pipeline that ran parallel to the Mafias and turned it into an empire. But power invites attention, and in the shadows of his success, the first cracks were beginning to form. By the early 1970s, Frank Matthews had turned his Brooklyn base into the command center of a drug empire that stretched across 21 states. From New York to Florida and as far west as Texas, his network supplied heroin and cocaine to hundreds of dealers who fed entire cities. Every shipment that landed in a basement or back room carried the same silent mark: clean and unmistakably his. He was careful about how he built it. His associates were loyal because he paid them well and treated them as partners rather than servants. Matthews understood that money and respect were stronger bonds than fear. He demanded discipline, not theatrics. The heroin that moved through his mills was cut and packaged with precision, each glassine envelope sealed by workers who never saw the man they were working for. His two main processing houses, the Ponderosa on Prospect Place and the Oak Coral on East 56th Street, became the lifeblood of his operation. They were built like fortresses with steel doors, bulletproof glass, and guards who watched over the entrances day and night. Matthews' operation was estimated to be moving millions of dollars every month. The Drug Enforcement Administration later said that he controlled the cutting, packaging, and distribution of heroin in every major city along the East Coast. In 1972 alone, he personally earned around $10 million, money that flowed into houses, cars, and casinos. He bought a home on Buttonwood Road in Staten Island, just 3 blocks from Paul Castellano, the head of the Gambino crime family. It was a quiet but defiant statement, a black drug lord setting up shop in the heart of an Italian mafia stronghold. He arrived in new Cadillacs, dressed sharply, and spoke softly, a man who understood power enough not to flaunt it. Yet everything about him challenged the established order. He moved money through Las Vegas, carrying suitcases of cash to be laundered through casino floors. The house always took its cut, 15 to 18%, but Matthews didn't care. He valued clean cash more than perfect profit. It was in those casinos, under the glow of the lights, that he became known to federal agents. They started to trace the movements of his money, the faces of his bodyguards, and the pattern of his flights. Despite his growing fame, Matthews remained cautious. He knew when to vanish and when to appear. He kept a small circle of confidence and used coded language over the phone. Even the DEA's best wiretaps yielded more mystery than evidence. They called him Black Caesar, a name that captured both his power and his independence. But success had its cost. Matthews' reach was too broad, and not everyone in his circle shared his discipline. The DEA began to close in, piecing together transactions, informants, and phone recordings. Rival crews whispered that he had gone too far, and the Italian families watched him with quiet resentment. In 1971, Matthews hosted a second meeting, this time in Las Vegas, during the rematch between Muhammad Ali and Jerry Quarry. Dealers from every major city attended, a gathering that was part business, part declaration. Matthews wanted the underworld to know that the days of asking permission were over. The meeting drew more than the attention of law enforcement. It drew envy, suspicion, and the first hints of betrayal. By 1972, Matthews' world was beginning to tilt. The same network that had made him rich now made him visible. Federal agents were watching, and his competitors were listening. The empire he built was about to face its first real test, and Frank Matthews, the man who never answered to anyone, was about to meet the one opponent even he couldn't outsmart: the law. The DEA had learned his habits, his travel patterns, and the rhythm of his organization. Every trip he took now carried eyes in the shadows. Agents followed him through airports, tracked the serial numbers of his cars, and intercepted phone calls that hinted at shipments and deals too large to ignore. Matthews could feel the air changing. His empire had grown so vast that secrecy was no longer possible. The money was too heavy, the traffic too wide. Even his lieutenants sensed that the walls were closing in. Still, he kept moving. He was too deep in the game to stop. In December 1972, the first real blow landed. Federal prosecutors in Brooklyn indicted Matthews for attempting to sell 40 pounds of cocaine in Miami earlier that year. The evidence had been building quietly: phone taps, wire reports, and undercover testimony. For the first time, the government had enough to drag him into court. Weeks later, he flew to Las Vegas, a city he knew better than most gamblers. It was there, at McCarran International Airport, that DEA agents moved in. They caught him with his girlfriend, Cheryl Denise Brown, as he prepared to board a flight to Los Angeles. The charges were heavy: tax evasion and conspiracy to distribute heroin and cocaine. If convicted, Matthews could spend the rest of his life in prison. The arrest sent a tremor through his network. Dealers from Philadelphia to New York held their breath, unsure if their kingpin would fight or fold. At his arraignment, a federal magistrate set bail at $5 million, the highest ever recorded at the time. The message was clear: Matthews was no ordinary defendant. He was an example. But Frank Matthews had never been a man easily contained. He hired sharp lawyers, agreed not to contest extradition to New York, and watched his bail fall from $5 million to $2.5 million. Then again to just $325,000. Within weeks, he was free. He walked out of detention smiling, as if the walls had never touched him. Behind that composure was a man calculating every exit. The DEA increased surveillance. They wanted him locked down before he could move his assets. Yet Matthews still managed to meet with associates, still planned deals, and still lived like a man untouchable. The agents who shadowed him later admitted that he didn't seem nervous, only deliberate. They suspected he was planning something much larger than his defense could handle. In April 1973, he made one last deal with the underworld that would haunt every investigator after him. A Genovese associate, Ernie Coco Coraluzzo, arranged to sell him 40 kilograms of heroin for $375,000 at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. Matthews delivered the money through an intermediary, but the drugs never came. Coraluzzo fled to the Bahamas with the cash. Matthews did not take betrayal lightly. Within days, his men kidnapped James "Big Jimmy" Capotorto, one of Coraluzzo's bodyguards. Word spread quickly, and the mobster returned to New York under pressure. He handed back the full amount and even supplied 25 kilograms of heroin on consignment as repayment. It was one of the few times the Mafia had to bow to a man outside its ranks. That incident marked the last clear glimpse of Frank Matthews in full control. Behind the scenes, indictments stacked higher, and whispers began to circulate that the feds were preparing to seize everything he owned. His name appeared on more watch lists, and his inner circle grew smaller. The mansion on Staten Island, once a symbol of his power, started to feel like a cage. He had money, connections, and time, but each was running out faster than the other. Matthews had escaped handcuffs once. Now he began to wonder if his next escape would have to be from the entire country. The summer of 1973 arrived heavy with heat and tension. Frank Matthews, once untouchable, now faced a trial that could erase the empire he had spent a decade building. The government had 6 counts against him: tax evasion, heroin distribution, and conspiracy. His fortune was under scrutiny, his homes watched, and his closest allies uncertain. On June 26, Matthews and Cheryl Denise Brown vanished. There was no announcement, no goodbye, and no clear trace. He was due in court a few days later, on July 2. When his name was called that morning, the chair sat empty. Reporters waited for movement. Agents whispered among themselves. The judge called his name again, but all there was silence. It was as if Frank Matthews had stepped off the edge of the map. Investigators flooded his properties. They found wardrobes full of suits, half-packed boxes, and family photos left behind. His common-law wife, Barbara Hinton, remained in Staten Island with their 3 sons. She claimed she hadn't seen him in days. Bank accounts were frozen, cars were traced, and associates questioned. None of it led anywhere. The DEA estimated that Matthews had fled with as much as $20 million. Money moved through layers of cash houses, front businesses, and offshore channels. To this day, not a single confirmed dollar has resurfaced. Rumors spread fast. Some said he had taken a private plane to Venezuela, protected by Spanish raiment, mercas, and Cuban connections. Others whispered that the Genovese family lured him to the Bahamas and killed him, a revenge for debts and betrayal. A few believed the Black Mafia turned on him after the chaos in Philadelphia, settling old scores. No body was found, no flight records confirmed, and no official sighting ever verified. The FBI put a $20,000 bounty on his capture, the highest reward since John Dillinger, the bank robber. Posters showed his mugshot with the words "wanted for drug trafficking and tax evasion." Agents chased tips across the Caribbean, South America, and even Africa. None of them led anywhere. Every lead ended in fog. For years, Matthews' name floated between legend and ghost story. Detectives said that a wealthy man could change his face, his name, and his life. Others said his arrogance made him careless, that someone took him out before he ever left the country. The truth stayed buried under time and silence. Those who knew him remembered that he never made reckless moves. He planned too precisely to vanish by accident. To some, that was proof he survived, that somewhere, far from the streets of Brooklyn, Frank Matthews lived quietly under another name, watching the years pass. To others, the absence itself was the message. He had done what no one else had. He had built an empire, challenged the Mafia, defied the government, and then disappeared without a trace. There was no trial, no confession, no witness, just a question that still echoes through the corridors of American crime. Where did Frank Matthews go? After Frank Matthews vanished, the world moved on. But his story slipped into whispers that spanned generations. A name passed quietly among detectives, dealers, and historians as they sought to separate myth from fact. To some, he was the Black Caesar who outplayed the mob and the government. To others, he was a cautionary tale, proof that ambition without restraint always ends the same way. His influence went deeper than the drugs he sold. Matthews represented something rare: independence in a world built on hierarchy. He had challenged La Cosa Nostra at its peak and proved that power could come from outside the established order. For Black and Latino dealers of the time, he was both an inspiration and a warning. The meetings he organized in Atlanta and Las Vegas signaled a turning point in the underworld, where those who had once worked under others now sought control of their own destinies. Yet the empire he built came with a cost measured in addiction, violence, and broken lives. Entire neighborhoods bore the scars of the trade he helped expand. The money that once flowed through his hands came from the same streets that would later mourn its losses. Matthews saw wealth and freedom. The communities around him saw chaos. Filmmakers, writers, and academics have attempted to capture him, each crafting a distinct portrayal of the man who vanished. In the Frank Matthews story, researchers compared his scale to that of legends like Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes, concluding that Matthews operated on a level neither of them reached. Historians describe him as part of the larger mythos of American crime, standing alongside outlaws and moguls who blurred the line between brilliance and destruction. But the mystery is that no one has ever found Frank Matthews. Not a body, not a bank trail, not a single confirmed sighting. He vanished the way he lived, on his own terms, leaving the world to guess where the line between freedom and disappearance truly lies. In the end, his empire fell, his friends scattered, and his name became a story told in hushed tones. Yet somewhere in the silence that followed, Frank Matthews achieved something few ever have. He became both legend and question, a man remembered not for how he was caught, but for how he was never found. In America's long story of outlaws and ambition, Matthews remains different. He wasn't a figure made for headlines or movies. He was a man who saw the limits of his time and refused them, not out of rebellion, but out of belief that he could build something greater. Whether that belief ended in paradise or in a shallow grave, no one knows. His rise exposed the hidden architecture of power in the 1970s, including the dealers, the mobsters, the bankers who laundered their money, and the agents who pursued them. His disappearance exposed something else, that even in a world of surveillance and control, it is still possible to vanish completely. Every legend leaves a trace, a fingerprint, a photograph, a body. Frank Matthews left nothing, no confession, no closure, just a question that haunts every investigator who has ever opened their file. Did he die? Did he escape? Or did he simply decide that disappearing was the only way to win? The story of Frank Matthews doesn't end with his empire or his crime. It ends with the one thing he always wanted most: freedom.